age of watchmen, a team of individuals pooling their talents and abilities come together to bring analysis, reaction, and comedy to the fold. This is their chronicle. This is Accounting Arc.
We're back today to talk about artificial intelligence, which has been, one of those big buzzwords hitting every industry pretty hard. I think since ChatGPT 4 came out, everyone's been kind of playing with it from the administrative side, thinking about what AI can actually do from a narrative perspective in, interpreting and helping with like human language, which is fascinating the way that it's developed. But what are the implications when it comes to finance and accounting? Because that's really what we care about, right? How these different techs affect our industry. So Donny, what are some of the like biggest things you've seen of AI influence on our industry?
The buzz, like you said, right now is around all the generative AI with the text and language and everything. But what I think people don't realize is that we've actually had AI operating within accounting for quite a while now. I mean, go all the way back to QBO, putting it in to help with the classification on the bank feeds. That was is that 10 years ago already at this point? I feel like we've had that for a long time. And then all of the bill reading and Expensify, I know, has it on receipt reading, which is why they can read the handwriting to figure out the tip and the totals. So I feel like it's kind of a misnomer that people go, oh, it's this new thing that's invading our industry. And it's like, actually, the vendors have it all in the background.
Yeah, I also agree with you. I think it's really fascinating how, people in accounting and finance, particularly people that got our degrees like us more than maybe 10 years ago, don't necessarily know the different pieces that go into AI, right? And so definitions are really important as well. And you brought up a term, generative AI. So generative AI, right, is the type of AI that can train on a big data set and then create new data. And that's kind of where, AI has gone to and what we'll see more investment into versus the type of AI that's already embedded in our accounting app. So machine learning is a type of AI, right? And machine learning is similar to generative AI in that it is trained on a big data set. They go through, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of transactions and teach it through algorithms what to predict should be next, right? But it's all done on averages and the user in that system versus generative AI, which is kind of still a black box even to data scientists, right? And so, the algorithms that they build create this ability to generate new content and new ideas, which is more than just numbers, right? It's not saying like one specific code, you have 100 to pick from, and then you pick a GL code. That's more machine learning type algorithms versus, hey, I'm going to give you a prompt that's narrative based and you're going to generate a response, where we've seen so many interesting things come out of, some of them actual reality, some of them completely made up, right? And I think it's really fascinating to like differentiate and historically understand where this has come from. But we've had programs like MindBridge in
Mhm.
accounting for a while. So, how does that work?
Well, even with those, I feel like there's something like MindBridge. To me, it's just another tool. So like Excel or any of these others, when you look at what it's doing, it's helping to automate what we already have defined as essentially a rules-based test that we're doing. The difference is that it's taking the results of that, aggregating that, and learning as you're working with it more to really pull everything together. So there's still this whole concept of learning instead of machine learning. When we look at the generative AI and things, it's more of that deep learning or those neural network type of activities rather than just what we're really working with. But they all kind of work together. And that's the other thing
Mhm.
I think people don't realize, that this is like, we're talking about different types of AI,
Mhm.
and they all kind of work together and sometimes not as well.
Right. So that type of AI is more pattern recognition in statistics. So again, that's back on the machine learning side where you give it a statistical data set and you say, hey, identify outliers. And instead of like an auditor that can only do statistical testing, that program is able to go through transaction level and go through all of the transactions to identify outliers. And so it's really, truly not, generative AI where it can generate new information. It's historical machine learning type algorithms where it gets better the more data sets that it sees because it understands statistically speaking what a bigger data set is. And if you think about it from a math perspective, the more data you have, the more understanding you have of the outliers and can really identify them, right? And that's all it's doing is identifying outliers and pulling them in for you to be a better auditor, right? So like you said, it's just another tool. And there's a few other tools, that have been trying to integrate AI into our everyday, like Microsoft and Copilot. Have you played with Copilot yet?
If not, and I'm kind of waiting for it because I know it's the general preview or whatever it is, general release preview is coming up. I believe it's next month, at the end of next month. But everything that I'm hearing sounds really great, and this is the stuff that I think makes more sense for us in looking at accounting as a whole, because it's something that is built into the tools. Like we started with Zero and QBO, it's built into the tool for us to be able to utilize it. And that's actually the way that I think we're going to see a lot of what we do in it. It's not going to be us going and creating new apps or creating new solutions so much as using the AI that's already built in or incorporated into as an add-on, maybe like this Copilot essentially as an add-on to the Office suite. That will leverage these tools that help us achieve specific things. Like I heard Copilot is really good at writing Excel formulas.
Yeah, it's really fascinating the way that Microsoft did that, right? Because they're building it on the same type of language learning models and the generative AI, but they're also releasing it in different pieces, and so they're building like a comprehensive Copilot, which is clever name, to build into all of the tools. So one of the things is we use Dynamics as our CRM. So I've had access to Sales Copilot for a month now, maybe a little longer. And it like anytime there's an email that has any indication that it's a sales email or a prospect or a client even, it'll give me prompts and say, would you like me to generate a response for you?
Ooh.
And I say, yes, please automate my responses. And sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it's not anything that I would ever use. But it is learning the way that I respond. So every time I edit it, it's getting better and better and better at predicting what I'm going to say, when I'm going to say it, and what my voice is. And so it's really fascinating on, just like in my Outlook, playing with that from a communication perspective. But it's also kind of scary because when you think about like, if I'm selling or if I hire someone onto my team to sell and they don't know our products very well, and you have Sales Copilot go in there and say, yeah, we can absolutely do your, crazy cost seg analysis for tax. We don't do that. We sub that out. And we're very open with our clients that we're not, a specialty tax credit shop. But it's scary because it could easily, answer the questions that the clients are coming in or the prospects are coming in with incorrectly because it makes stuff up, right? And I think that that's like a big question around, like, how to use this type of software ethically. Like, I don't know if you saw the case where the lawyer cited a case that doesn't exist because he used ChatGPT to write his case brief.
Yes, I saw that.
Like that is terrifying and also fascinating. Like the fact that it got through, like so to back up, ChatGPT made up a legal case that a lawyer then cited in his argument in front of a court. Like what?
Well, and I think you're bridging to what I think is even more important that we look at from a professional standpoint as an accounting professional, which is that these technologies really are just tools. And I often tell people, think of them as like a junior staff. So they can help do all this grunt work, like draft the email response, come up, do some of the research, do the initial research for me, but you still need to come back. You need to apply your judgment to it. Does it make sense? You need to go and verify the same way you would ask a staff member. Well, show me where you got this from, what tax regs, or what part of the standard, or are using authoritative source, like all of this type of stuff, because all of this is taught a lot off the internet. And yeah, we all know we can completely trust the information that's on the internet.
Right. And I mean, you bring up a bigger thought around that as well, which is, they're training these data sets on massive amounts of information that has been filtered mostly by very cheap labor in other parts of the world, who don't necessarily speak English as their primary language. And so when you start to like backtrack into understanding where the information is coming from, it's cleaned data from the internet. And cleaned is a person in there cleaning it and identifying it in a way that the program can learn from it. And it's biased. By and far, the internet is a biased place, and it embeds all of the biases of society. And, I mean, I think both of us are in marginalized communities, and thinking about the implications of, bigoted information getting fed into that and multiplied, because if you think about it from like a programming perspective, the full amount of information is huge, right? And so to train this, you have to truncate it, right? But when you truncate something on the output, it ends up being multiplied to get back to the full size, right? So even if, the bias is small by percentage-wise statistically in the general data set, it will come out the other side much larger than the input. And so it magnifies any biases that it finds because it believes that to be truth. And that's really terrifying when you start thinking about that from, generative AI and what happens from a content perspective, and how people are using it, and what they need to do to filter to make sure that it's not biased.
Completely. And I think you raise another good point, which is people say the technology is biased, and it's not the technology that's biased. It's a reflection of society and what's out there. So we have to remember that, because part of what as I see that more, I feel like that's where perhaps the two extremes, where they push a lot of content out, and there really are more of us that are, per se, moderate or in the middle, that or have perhaps the majority perspective, and we're not in the minorities that are being the most vocal, that we need to make sure that we're getting more content out there. But this whole bias, that's the other one that I talk about a lot when I'm talking. I've spoken both with regulators as well as other practitioners around, hey, we got to understand where these biases are and how do we actually stop them, because it can actually cause problems. The one example I always use is, if you're using AI to help with recruiting analytics or performance analytics around staff, if you were to go and take a sample right now and say, let's look at the leaders in our profession and who's up there at the top, it would tell you that it's older white male, so based upon that, AI is going to say, well, who do you hire? You hire younger white male. And tell me how many issues that's going to cause as you start to look at not just DEI issues, but even things like EEO compliance and things. So we need to make sure that we put the right safeguards or controls in place to say, hey, ignore race, ignore gender, and ignore age, definitely, as we look at all this stuff.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating to think about the implications, but it's also terrifying when you really start to see when you see the biases come out in the technology directly. Yeah, it becomes a concern of like immense proportion, where we have very few people thinking about, ethical uses of data, and how that can interfere in like larger issues, right? So my sister is actually a data scientist, so I'm lucky enough to get to talk to her a lot about this stuff. But one of the examples she uses is like the classic example of data misuse. And I think about an insurance company, right? So it is illegal for an insurance company to charge more based on race, based on, like specific protected demographics, right? However, it is not illegal for an insurance company to change rates based on zip code.
Mm.
So if you think about that, when you look at large cities, people of specific races tend to live in specific neighborhoods. And they started early in like the 90s and early 2000s, really using that data and getting the ability to hone in on who they could discriminate against without illegally discriminating against them. And now, whose responsibility is it to bring that up, right? Is it the responsibility of the data scientists that they hired to do statistical analysis and tell them what trends they find in terms of car break-ins in different neighborhoods? Is it, you know, the manager who reviewed that work, who's making recommendations on rates to the higher levels? Or is it the executive team to say, hey, we realize this is an issue and there's a bias point in this data that's directly correlated to race. We should eliminate that being a point of, you know, how we do our business, but none of them did. So whose responsibility is it? Who stands up? And I say it's every individual. So if you're the statistical analysis person, 100%. You need to raise a red flag and say, hey, this is directly correlated. And, you know, I see this as a biased use of data. And also as a manager, say, no, we're not going to do that. That doesn't make sense. And as an executive, say, absolutely not. Like that might make more money for the company, but that's not what we're only about, right? We need to be ethical in the way that we're using the information.
Completely agree. And a lot of that, I think, ties back into effectively corporate governance. The need to ensure that we have these programs around DEI to raise awareness so that it, like sexual harassment training, like acceptable use policies in IT, that we're providing the training out there to create the awareness for everyone or anyone that happens to make that connection go, wait, these things are connected. So even though it's not a violation, it's an indirect violation of some of these things, that we can adopt that. The second layer, and I start to think then of the 3 lines of defense model from the IIA, the Institute of Internal Auditors, that says, okay, so finance and kind of your first one there. The second one is an audit. So in audit actually needs to be very much informed of these types of things and to do more of that critical thinking around, is the way that this thing has been designed, are we actually addressing some of these issues? Because it could actually, it's probably just a matter of a court case coming through that says, hey, this is indirectly causing this and it's in violation. And then now they're going to set a new standard. And you don't want to be the company that ends up having to deal with that.
Yeah, but it's also like, I think we need to embed it into our culture to think about these things and be literate. I mean, the same way we need to be literate understanding the media right now and the bias that's spun in there, we also need to be literate understanding how this technology works and what we need to be looking for as we use it. Which leads me into, you know, another thought around our particular industry, right? Like, you can go to any conference and hear somebody talking about how AI can just replace an auditor tomorrow, right? Well, first off, it can't, because regulatorily it cannot. That's not going to happen, right? But foundationally, there is the technology available to do the type of work that auditors do: the statistical analysis, the testing, the, you know, confirmations, even all of the work papers that we prepare can be done and tech assisted. So where is it okay for, you know, an auditor, like a senior associate, to use these tools, and where is it not okay? Like, how do you draw that line ethically?
That, I think, actually is a very easy answer. And the answer is that they can always use tools, right? The difference, though, is that the tool, and again, I always tell people, think of it as like a staff. The tool needs to be supervised. We need to look at the output that it's providing. Does it make sense? And exercise our professional judgment as the senior, the manager, the partner, whoever it is, to look at, does this make sense? Is it doing what I'm doing? And as you indicated earlier, also looking at it and going, did we put the proper safeguards in place? Are we using biased data? Is what the tool is working with somehow, and then going to create a perverse outcome? So I think it's awareness, as you said, and it's not restricting people from using this, but making sure that they understand the implications of actually using these types of tools. And that actually goes both to our domestic code of conduct, both within the ethics standards of us in the U.S. profession, as well as the international standards. I was involved, I think it's like 3 years ago, at the international level in some of the discussions that were being held with IASBA, the International Ethics Standards Board, in looking at how is the use of AI being, how is that going to impact the profession? They were very much focused in the audit realm because the question was, can I just let AI do everything and then I just follow whatever it is? And the answer definitely was no. I mean, that while people think you can do that, we all know audit and the interpretation of the standard financial reporting standards really is a judgment call. It's also why you can't just use the automatic coding is in there with all the vendors that are coming through, vendors that could have uses, or even items. If you're able to get to the item level, items could have multiple uses, always need to be flagged for human review. Because if it starts to code it wrong, that becomes just this ramping thing because it's learning from the wrong thing. And then it's going to magnify that problem, as you said earlier.
Mm-hmm. And I would break it down like a little more granularly as well in like a practical way. So we talk about this internally at HiRock frequently with the team. It's like, where the data goes, right? So some of these tools are, very secure, their privacy levels are absolutely, ready for financial data and identified financial data. And some of them, all of that information goes into the data set. So you have to understand when you're using a tool where the data is going. Is it just for purposes of this one analysis you're doing, or is it going into the mass data set that will be used to draw on for future of anybody using that tool? And there are ways to utilize identified data and anonymize it and put it into the mass general pool, which some companies do, and most of them unfortunately don't. So you have to really understand the privacy and security around where the data goes. So like, I tell my client, or I tell my team that with client data, you can't put our clients' financial statements with identified data into something like a ChatGPT and say, craft a CFO letter for the month, right? Because it's using identified data, right? And it's using information that is private to our clients and is not something that we're authorized to share with the public effectively. But you can use a tool that's like designed for that type of data privacy to do that type of work, right? And so differentiating and understanding underlying where the information is going is very important. Like I think using ChatGPT as a baby auditor to say, hey, write a generic footnote about this issue and just make it very general, right? And then you fill in the client information and you fill in the numbers that are relevant for each year and the little, sub table that has to go with all the footnotes, right? That's something I think is totally reasonable. And it's a tool to help because I guarantee you, when I was a baby auditor, I was Googling stuff, right? It's the same thing. If you're like ChatGPT, write a basic footnote, but you have to verify it, right? So you have to go back to prior financial statements or other client financial statements and look at it and say, is this the right wording? Is this what I'm trying to communicate? And do what Donny said, right? You have to like think through it as the human in the room and review it as you would anything else. But I think that that's a phenomenal use of the tool. Whereas, maybe not putting client specific and identifying information into the tool is better. But I have seen uses, where people have fed in like full financial statements, full and into ChatGPT and spit out some really great board reports. I personally wouldn't do it because I don't know where that data is going. And I don't want to be liable when my client comes back and says, hey, this was a data breach and a privacy issue. So now, our information is somewhere else on the internet, like help us out financially, right? So you got to think through the implications of where the information is going.
Completely. And I think with that, what we're going to actually, I'm already seeing it in some of the articles I'm reading, is that, when we talked about this whole move to the cloud, there was the public cloud, the Google, the S4, S3, and Microsoft's Azure systems. And then there's the private clouds. And this is where we've got, right now, most of us are working with public AI, which is then potentially incorporating some of what you submit into the public knowledge base. But I'm starting to read articles more about the private cloud. And I think it was Boston Consulting Group. There was a couple about how they're actually working with it to enable their own consultants, and they're starting to work with other large companies that have, because you do need that volume of data, to teach it, to incorporate AI, to go back against what's within your own corporate or your own business's data store and leverage that to generate something rather than the entire population.
Yeah, and it's really, really interesting too how different companies have used their own data. And of course, the tools are better the more data you have. So unfortunately, as a small firm, we just don't have the data sets to be able to build something ourselves that would be very useful without training it on someone else's data. However, like the big four all have enough data of their own to be able to train it just on their data, and just create their own private cloud tool. And back, I think even 10 years ago, a few of them were working on AI around tax positions, right? And like building tools that would review information from clients and put it through the database of all their other clients' information and say, oh, we took this tax position and it caused this effect. You should recommend that to your client. And then doing the support research and providing a tax research memo just straight from the software, which I think is fascinating. I'm not sure what ended up happening with that tool, but I do know that it was in development and it was really interesting. But I think as these technologies get better and better, and the other side of it is it used to take a lot longer to train them. So data scientists have gotten better at building algorithms that truncate training time, right? Because you do have to give it the ability to process through massive amounts of information. And basically they've done it by, condensing algorithms, which again magnifies bias and magnifies issues with the data set. So you have to have a really clean data set to use those truncated algorithms. And they've also done it through, better processing speeds and the ability to utilize better technology at this point. But it's only getting faster and it's only getting better. And so it means that, instead of taking 4 years to build something like this, it could potentially take months in the future. And we'll start seeing these types of things pop up in every sector, in every direction. And we'll have, the micro companies, the macro companies, the first movers, the late movers. And at some point, we'll have a consolidation into what our tools will actually be moving forward. And I hope that we have some regulatory change around use of tools and around, how these companies have to secure our data, similarly to what, Europe's doing.
Yeah, well, and I think that's, you're raising that. You've said that several times about the privacy and the use of data, and so that's something too that I think anyone in our profession really needs to focus on, is making sure that you actually are getting the right permissions from the clients, especially with the tax data. There's very specific requirements that the IRS has around sharing of tax information with a third party, and then also especially if it's ending up being used for marketing purposes. So tax preparers in particular need to be very, very cautious and ensure that they're getting the right types of permissions from the clients if they're going to use this type of technology with the tax data.
Absolutely. We have a generic release on our engagement letters, effectively saying we can use your data internally, and we can use it with, appropriate, companies that have the appropriate privacy certifications, but we will never share it publicly. But we also, for tax reasons, because we have tax data, because we're an accounting firm, we have them sign off that they understand their tax data may be sent outside of the borders of the US. And it's a really interesting gray area right now because, the IRS started that requirement. You had to sign off on individual tax data, particularly being shipped overseas when there was, those big outsourcing shops happening from the bigger accounting firms, 20, 30 years ago when they started. And they wanted taxpayers aware that, that could happen. Great, but fast forward, now the information is accessible and it's on servers that are not in the US. So what does that mean? Right? Like, what does it mean? Do we have to get those releases? Do we not?
That one definitely, yes. That one, and for the people that aren't familiar with it, it's the 7216 disclosures. Yep. So with that requirement, everything that I'm seeing, I've talked both with the E&O insurance brokers and providers, and I've talked with the AICPA about this one. So anytime it's being accessed, and definitely if it's moving outside of domestic soil, that's definitely going to be required. The interesting one of the very large accounting firms actually, because there's an exception that's provided in there for what's effectively incidental travel. So if you as a tax preparer happens to leave US soil and you're on vacation or you're working remote for like a week or so, there's an exception provided that you don't have to get that. But what happens when that becomes longer? And so it was interesting to see one of the large, I think they might be a top 20 firm, kind of take this position of that allowance was only for that clause or that whatever section it was in. And so they're saying that they're not even allowing their staff to have this incidental access if they're outside of the US. Another very large firm actually shared that their position is they have all clients regardless always sign the 7216.
That's
so
what
that
we
they
do.
didn't have to worry, because they were like, well, if you only do some, then you have to remember, well, these signed it and those didn't, and how do I figure out my data? So I think the norm is going to be everyone just ends up having their clients sign it.
Yeah, and that's what we decided to do, because we do have a remote team. Most of our team is US based, but they travel frequently, and we ended up hiring a US citizen who then moved to Bulgaria, and he's on our tax team. So he's going to touch any number of clients at any point, and he does live there permanently. So I think it's really fascinating when you start like digging into the details and talking to the insurance companies about data usage. And I know that this is kind of a segue from AI, but I promise I'll wrap it back in, because like the regulatory environment overarching all of it is not set up for the environment that we have, right? So at what point will accessing that tax data by an AI tool that's hosted on a server in, let's say Indonesia, count as accessing that data, right? And I think it's coming soon, honestly. And I really think that I think that our regulations are not close to caught up to where AI is. I don't think our profession really understands holistically what the software capabilities are at this point. And I do think that there's some scrappy startups pulling it in and using it in like super cool ways and building stuff that'll kind of withstand the next iteration without, complete replatforming of the technology. But I think that our regulations are not there yet. And I think that we need to be thoughtful about it and ethical about it and very upfront with our clients about use of these types of programs.
That's exactly where my mind went to, because I hear people say, well, I'm just going to wait until the regulation comes. And this is one where our profession needs to stay ahead of that, because it's going to take a long, especially with our US legislative process right now, that's going to take quite a while. You can't wait for that. And I always kind of like to turn it back to the biggest thing in this usually ends up being public sentiment. What happens if your firm or your company is the one that's in the news because you allowed the data be used in this certain way, or you used AI in this certain way? That's the risk. It's that reputational risk. It's that what's going to happen from a public outcry. I think that's where we need to take and look at this from.
Well, and I think it's like it goes even a level deeper, because, I think you as a human are incredibly high level in your thought process, and you are very involved with international associations and national associations and state boards of accountancy and all the people running the firms, right? So like as a firm leader running a firm, 100%, I don't want my firm to be in the news because we're the ones that did the thing that created the regulation. Like, absolutely not. I don't want to be that person. But I also want to give enough innovative ability to our team to utilize some of these cutting edge tools, and to feel empowered instead of just shut down, right? And so, if you are a big firm, if you're a medium-sized firm, if you're a small firm and you're like, hands off, hard stop, not doing it, I don't understand it, my staff can't use it, they're not going to listen. They will use it. Particularly the I say kids, but like graduating from college right now, the young adults in our profession that are coming out, like they're used to using these tools for their schoolwork. And quite frankly, they're probably better attuned to what type of review is needed of those tools than even you are, and
No,
giving them the
wait,
ability.
that one I totally gotta disagree with you on. So when you look at, yes, they're used to using it. The understanding of the standards, the privacy, and all of those, they definitely don't have those. We're seeing when you look at the research, just even from a data breach standpoint, that this incoming generation is actually the highest at risk and have had the most incidences with them actually being subject to the teams because they don't know. They automatically trust the data, they trust the technology. So there's actually a very strong need for education around what is actually appropriate and what we should be doing and not doing as part of their part of bringing
Let
them
me
into
back up and rephrase. The kids coming out of school know how to use the tools better than you do. You know the industry, you know the privacy, you know what is allowed in your firm, you know what should be, right? And need to train them. 100% agree with that. And I think that there's a whole level of training coming on how to appropriately use these tools and what the ethical side of it is. And I'm pretty sure Donnie's already presented it 75 times because that's who he is. But if you back up and think about when Excel was first introduced, who was the best and most efficient at using that? It was the younger generation. It was my generation coming out of school, knowing how to do VLOOKUPs, knowing how to program in Visual Basic to build our own tools. And my supervisors had no idea how the program worked in the background of it. When I was building VBA code to do analysis on different parts of audit work papers, my supervisors were like, I don't even understand how this works to make sure that it's right. And so our conversations went into, okay, let me show you how I did this calculation. Let me explain the background and then you tell me if it's right. Right. And I think that translated a level up is where we're at now, right? They know what prompts to use in these tools to get the answers they want. They know how to efficiently use these tools. They know how to integrate these tools. They know how to pull them together and do, basically they're lazy. Let's be honest, we're all kind of lazy at the core of it. We're going to use tech so that we don't have to manually do it, right? Well, I might understand the data privacy issues, the ethical issues, all the potential things that come out of it, but they understand foundationally in their DNA how to actually make the thing do the thing they want. Does that make sense?
That does, and I completely agree with you on that point. The other thing that's been interesting, just having been in a bunch of different conferences over the last couple of weeks, is to hear the different perspectives on how people are doing this. And so I got to hear one, again, large regional firm, their position was, we're blocking everything. And I was like, oh my God, here we go again with the internet and search and social media. That didn't work then. It's not going to work now. You need to let people use the tools because they'll find ways around it, whoever it is, whether it's the young one or even the ones. We all know the workarounds now. Everybody also has their phones and things that they're just going to go to that. So it's really, I think, awareness and understanding that we have to bridge across. I want to follow on something that you said, because I think it's really important, which is you said, yeah, we created the VBA and all that stuff. I did that kind of stuff too. The important thing that we did, and I heard you say it, was we explained to the higher ups, the manager, partner, whoever, this is what we did and this is what it's actually doing. And this is where I don't think enough, let's say, senior managers, partners up at that level, even CFOs, I don't think they're taking the time to make sure that they understand, at least at the conceptual level, what has been done or how the tools are used. And that actually goes back to supervision, part of our code of ethics. You cannot, it's actually specifically called the intimidation threat, and it's the intimidation of technology. So you cannot go, well, that's that technology and it's this new, I'm automatically going to trust and believe what it says. That's called the intimidation threat to ethic, and it's part of our ethical code. So we need to make sure that the counter to that intimidation threat is that we are taking time to at least understand conceptually what's happening or what it did, and that you can then validate and say, oh, that makes sense, and that's something that we should do.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good thought. And I also believe more people need to understand foundationally how these technologies work so that they can do that, because it's getting to the point where the tools become, the user interfaces are so easy that it's very easy to skip the how does it actually do what it's doing, so that you can appropriately review it and understand, and not end up in, the situation that lawyer did where he cited a case that doesn't exist because ChatGPT made it up. That's why it's called generative AI. It generates information. If there's nothing there for it to pull on, it's going to create something that sounds realistic to finish its program and finish its prompt. And that's terrifying.
Completely. So how would you summarize this? What's our advice to people out there?
I think our TLDR is AI is here. Generative AI is different than machine learning, but machine learning has been in the accounting space for a long time. Our code of ethics should be considered at every point in time, and we need to understand the tech, review it, and manage it appropriately, making sure that we're ahead of the regulatory environment and we're advising on what it looks like for the future of our profession.
Awesome. I want to go feed the transcript that we said into it and then see if it can the same thing that you just said, because that was a great summary of what we discussed today.
Well, I always appreciate your time and talking to you about these fun topics.
And you as well, Liz. We'll look forward to the next time.
The Center for Accounting Transformation provides business professionals with a network for utilizing innovations that are ready for adoption, the training and resources necessary to apply those innovations, and an opportunity to engage the talent and community needed to further the pursuit of innovative accounting practices that drive responsible and mindful business performance. Find out more at our website, www.improvetheworld.net. And if you're interested in sharing your own transformation stories, please contact us there.